Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here, ready to dig into the sources you've sent over all that complex material on philosophy, history, culture, and really try to crystallize what it means for us.
And today we're tackling a huge one, a real philosophical battlefield, this constant push and pull between the idea of universal truths and the undeniable reality of cultural differences.
Yeah, it sounds academic, maybe, but the stakes are incredibly high, right? This isn't just ivory tower stuff. It really drills down to whether we can even have fundamental ethics or political ideas that genuinely work everywhere.
Exactly. Or are all of those big claims about human rights, about justice, about reason itself, are they inevitably limited, shackled, to the specific place, the language, the history they came from?
It's this core conflict, isn't it? Is philosophy searching for something timeless, something fundamentally human that transcends culture? Or is it always a product of its environment, inseparable from its roots?
And the sources you've provided bring up a really uncomfortable point right at the start. Historically, these claims of universality, especially from the West, well, they haven't always been used neutrally.
Hmm. Often used to exclude, you mean?
Precisely. You get these grand pronouncements about universal reason, universal values, but then you look at the history and see a pretty consistent pattern. Other traditions, African, Asian, indigenous philosophies, they often get pushed aside, defined as somehow not the real deal.
Which leads straight to that central paradox you highlighted. If philosophical truths are universal, if they're accessible to any rational mind, anywhere, anytime, then why has the main stage, historically speaking, been so dominated by just one tradition, the Western one?
That's the kicker, isn't it? If the door to truth is supposedly wide open, why does the historical guest list look so selective?
It really suggests that maybe the universal path had some hidden tolls, some entry requirements that only certain groups were positioned to meet. Or maybe the definition of universal was rigged from the start.
And that's why this deep dive is so critical. If all philosophy is just relative, just culturally specific, then our hopes for shared global ethics, for common ground, seem, well, pretty shaky, limited by borders.
But the flip side is just as risky.
Yeah.
If we charge ahead, assuming our ideas are the universal ones, we risk repeating history, right? Projecting our own local biases onto everyone else and calling it enlightenment.
It's a tightrope walk. Our mission today, then, is to really map out this intellectual battlefield, these universal dreams clashing against these cultural realities. And maybe the best place to start is by questioning the very thing we're talking about. What even is philosophy?
Okay, so first base. The word philosophy itself, when you dive into the sources, it becomes immediately clear this isn't some neat, tidy box.
Right, it's not like defining mammal or something.
Not at all. It's more like a label slapped onto a whole range of incredibly diverse, sometimes even conflicting intellectual activities across history and across cultures. So finding one single universal foundation for philosophy is tricky from the get-go. It feels like trying to find the single universal essence of games. When you're looking at chess and, I don't know, playground tag,
Yeah,
the activities themselves are just so different.
exactly. And here's a crucial insight from the source material. This definitional messiness isn't just an accident of history. The act of defining what counts as philosophy, what gets included and what gets left out, that itself has historically been an exercise in power.
So the definition becomes a gatekeeping tool, a way to say, this is legitimate thought, and that over there, well, that's just custom or religion or maybe just noise.
Precisely. The definition itself can be a potent political and cultural weapon. And the sources give us a perfect, if unsettling, example with Hegel.
Hegel, right. His philosophy seems, on the surface, very aware of context.
Yeah.
Didn't he talk about philosophy holding its time and thought, rooting it in the historical process?
He absolutely did. His whole system revolves around the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. Reason unfolds through history, he argued, and philosophy is the self-understanding of that unfolding process. It sounds very specific, very tied to time and place.
Okay, so far so good. Seems like he's acknowledging the cultural roots. But the sources point out a sharp turn, don't they?
A very sharp turn. He took that very idea that philosophy represents the culmination of a historical process, and he weaponized it. He used it to explicitly exclude non-Western thought.
How did that work exactly? How did he use the context argument to exclude?
By arguing that certain cultures, specifically what he termed Oriental and African thought, were essentially stuck, prehistorical. They lacked the necessary internal dynamism, the self-consciousness that he believed was essential for true philosophical development.
Which, naturally, had only reached its peak in his time and place, specifically German idealism.
You got it. So it wasn't just saying their answers are wrong, it was a much deeper exclusion. It was saying they hadn't even reached the stage where proper philosophy, as he defined it, was possible. They were outside the historical unfolding of reason itself.
Wow, that's quite a move. To take a seemingly context-aware principle and twist it into the ultimate justification for exclusion, defining only your own cultural moment as intellectually mature enough.
It's a stunning piece of intellectual maneuvering. And that act, using a supposedly particular argument, philosophy reflected at its time, to enforce a universal hierarchy, only our time reflects it properly, that really sets the stage for so many later conflicts. It's the historical shadow looming over this whole debate.
Okay, so that's one extreme, a definition rooted in history but used to exclude. What about the other end of the spectrum? The sources also mention attempts at pure universality, right? Definitions trying to escape culture altogether.
Yes, and even those attempts show a real lack of consensus. You get these incredibly broad, maximalist claims, like Guildford Sellers' definition you pulled out. Philosophy is about understanding how things in the broadest possible sense hang together in the broadest possible sense.
That sounds ambitious, almost overwhelmingly so. It's trying to capture the coherence of everything. But does that breadth make it practically useful? If philosophy is everything, is it anything specific?
That's the inherent risk of that kind of cosmic abstraction, isn't it? It might become too vague to offer real guidance. And then on the complete flip side, you have the minimalist, very formal approach.
Like Andrew Seth Pringle Patterson's idea,
Yeah.
defining philosophy simply as a criticism of categories.
Exactly. That treats philosophy much less like a quest for ultimate truth and more like, well, like a tool. A specific intellectual skill set, a method for analyzing concepts, checking their consistency, clarifying meaning, almost like quality control for thought, applicable anywhere.
So a neutral methodology rather than a specific worldview.
That's the idea behind it. But look at the sheer range we've just covered.
Yeah.
From Hegel's deeply historical yet exclusionary view, to Sellers' almost boundless abstraction, to Patterson's tight technical focus.
It really drives home the point that even when philosophers try to define their field in a universal way, escaping cultural specifics, they can't even agree on what that escape hatch looks like. The definition itself is the battleground.
Absolutely. And that battle gets even more complex, even more fundamental, when we seriously bring non-Western philosophical traditions into the picture, because they often operate from entirely different starting premises.
Like the example from the Indian scholar Kartapalli Radhakrishnan. His definition sounds radically different.
It is. He defines philosophy not as achieving some static final truth or even just critiquing categories, but as a progressive discovery of reality or a gradual process.
A process, not a fixed endpoint. That changes everything, doesn't it?
It really does. A lot of Western philosophy, especially in the analytic tradition, is searching for foundations, fixed points, universal principles you can build upon with certainty. It's about solving problems, establishing truth.
But if philosophy is a progressive discovery, like Radhakrishnan suggests, then the value isn't necessarily in finding the answer. It's in the ongoing journey, the deepening understanding. Truth today might just be a waypoint to a better understanding tomorrow.
Which fundamentally challenges that Western drive for static, final, universally applicable systems, whether in ethics or metaphysics. It suggests the game itself is different.
That distinction, philosophy as finding a static definition versus philosophy as continuous, unfolding discovery that feels absolutely crucial for navigating this whole universal particular tension. It shows the conflict isn't just about different answers to the same questions.
It's often about asking fundamentally different questions, pursuing different goals, based on radically different ideas of what the whole intellectual enterprise is for.
Okay, so that historical tendency in the West, defining philosophy as this search for static, universal truth, often implicitly positioning itself as the peak achievement that really laid the groundwork for exclusion.
And the crucial point the sources emphasize is that these universal claims rarely floated free in some neutral academic space. They were often deeply entangled with power, with cultural hierarchy, even with imperialism.
This seems like the perfect entry point for Edward Said's work, Orientalism. The source is highlighted as a key case study for understanding this dynamic.
Absolutely. Orientalism is foundational here. Said meticulously documented how Western academic fields, literature, and art didn't just study the Orient, they actively constructed it.
Constructed it how? Not just misunderstanding, but something more deliberate.
More systemic. Said argued it was based on a fundamental binary. The West defined itself against its constructed image of the East. To be Western, rational, dynamic, progressive, scientific required an other, the Orient, which was defined as the opposite.
So the Orient became exotic, sensual, yes, but also irrational, unchanging, despotic, stuck in the past.
Exactly. By creating this essentialized, often negative stereotype of the East, the West could simultaneously solidify its own positive self-image as the rightful bearer of universal reason, progress, and, well, true philosophy.
So the claim to universality wasn't just about ideas. It actively helped build a cultural and political hierarchy. The universal West versus the particular and often implicitly inferior East.
Precisely. It was an intellectual process that provided justification, consciously or unconsciously, for colonial domination and economic exploitation. That legacy, where universality claims can mask power dynamics, is absolutely vital context for everything that follows.
And it's not just ancient history, is it? The sources argue this mindset, the assumption that the Western abstract global norm is the default and local ways are just deviations, continues to cause real problems today.
Big problems. This is where those abstract, supposedly universal rules hit the wall when they encounter specific, deeply rooted local contexts. The real-world case studies you brought up are stark illustrations.
Let's talk about bioethics in Africa. Western bioethics, generally speaking, is heavily built on Enlightenment foundations, right? Individual autonomy, informed consent, the rights of the single patient.
Very much so. Those are often treated as the gold standard, the universal principles. But the sources point out that when you try to apply these rules rigidly in many African cultural contexts, they often just don't fit. Or worse, they cause harm.
Because local norms might prioritize something else, like community well-being or family decision-making, or the authority of elders over the absolute autonomy of one person.
Exactly. It's not necessarily less ethical, it's a different ethical framework altogether, often prioritizing relationality and collective good. So, if a well-meaning Western bioethicist comes in and insists strictly on individual informed consent, ignoring family or community leaders,
They might not be upholding a universal good. They could actually be disrupting a functioning, locally legitimate system of care and decision-making. The universal rule becomes a source of ethical failure in that context.
it's a perfect example of universality crashing against particularity. And we see a very similar pattern in the other case study. Global corporate behavior clashing with local norms in Central America.
Okay, so global corporate standards often emphasize things like shareholder value above all else. Short-term profit maximization, very specific interpretations of contracts, labor laws.
Yes, a model largely developed in the West. But in parts of Central America, as the sources note, you encounter very different, deeply embedded cultural norms, maybe prioritizing long-term community stability, reciprocal obligations between employers and employees that go beyond a contract, or indigenous land rights based on history and stewardship, not just legal title.
And the global corporate model might view those local norms as, what? Inefficient, irrational, obstacles to progress.
Often, yes, deviations from the rational economic norm. But from the local perspective, the global corporate practices focused solely on extraction or short-term gain might seem incredibly destructive, violating fundamental social and ecological responsibilities.
So again, it's not just a disagreement about money. It's a clash between two fundamentally different philosophies about the purpose of economic activity, the nature of property, and the structure of society. One deeply individualistic, the other perhaps more communal or ecological.
Precisely. These clashes highlight the limits and sometimes the dangers of imposing abstract, supposedly universal rules without understanding the coherent logic of the local system. Which brings us to another crucial warning from the sources, this one about the very act of trying to understand across cultures.
You're talking about Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak's work, specifically her essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?
Yes. It's a landmark piece. Spivak focuses on the subaltern, those groups most marginalized, most silenced by structures of power like colonialism, caste, patriarchy, people whose voices historically haven't been heard in dominant narratives.
And her argument is that the silencing isn't just done by the oppressors, right?
Right.
It's more complicated than that.
Much more complicated. The really challenging insight is that sometimes the silencing happens inadvertently, even through the efforts of well-intentioned outsiders, particularly Western intellectuals, who try to speak for or analyze the subaltern using their own theoretical frameworks.
How does that work? If you're using, say, Marxism or a universal human rights framework to understand their oppression, aren't you trying to help?
You're trying to help, yes. But Spivak argues that those very frameworks, developed in specific Western historical and intellectual contexts, might impose categories and assumptions that don't actually fit the subaltern's lived reality or self-understanding.
So the language of liberation, because it comes from outside, might actually override or distort the subaltern's own unique perspective. It puts words in their mouth, even if the intention is good.
Exactly. It creates this structural bind where the subaltern is represented perhaps, but not truly heard on their own terms. Their specific experience gets filtered, translated, and potentially misrepresented through the lens of the universal theory applied to them. The intellectual, in trying to give them a voice, might paradoxically reinforce their silence.
That's a profoundly difficult idea. It suggests that even our best efforts at cross-cultural understanding or advocacy need extreme humility and a constant awareness of how our own universal tools might be part of the problem.
It really underscores the need to be incredibly critical of any claim to universality, especially when speaking about or for others. We have to constantly ask, whose universal is it? And does it actually create space for the particular voices it claims to represent?
Okay, so we've seen the historical baggage of exclusion and the real-world failures of abstract universal rules. It paints a pretty challenging picture. Where do we go from here?
The sources must offer some ways forward, right? Some thinkers trying to bridge this divide. They do. Having laid out the problems, the next step is looking at the architects of potential solutions thinkers, who are trying to navigate this complex territory, trying to find ways to honor both the universal and the particular.
Right, because the challenge is immense. How do we maintain some kind of shared ethical ground, some basis for global cooperation, the universal impulse, without just bulldozing diverse cultures and local ways of life? We need models that can hold both.
And the sources introduce several key thinkers who are grappling with precisely this. Perhaps the most direct attempt to build this bridge comes from Kwame Anthony Appiah and his concept of cosmopolitanism.
Cosmopolitanism.
Yeah.
Okay, what's the core idea there? How does he try to reconcile the universal and the particular?
Appiah insists on two things simultaneously. First, he argues for a fundamental universal respect for human dignity. We have obligations to all human beings simply because they are human, regardless of where they live or what group they belong to. That's the universal anchor.
Okay, a baseline of shared humanity.
But, and this is crucial, he strongly rejects the idea that this means we should all melt into one bland, uniform global culture. His cosmopolitanism actively champions the value of difference. It respects local identities, cultural traditions, languages, what he calls our rootedness.
So you could be a citizen of the world, in his view, without having to give up your local attachments, your specific cultural home.
Exactly. He argues that our local identities are actually important sources of meaning and value in our lives. The goal isn't to erase them in favor of some abstract universal identity, but to learn to live together with our differences, respecting both our shared humanity and our diverse ways of living it.
But how does that work in practice? Doesn't that universal respect for dignity risk becoming just another abstract rule, like the ones that fail in the case studies if we're not careful? Where do you draw the lines when universal dignity clashes with a specific cultural practice?
That's always the difficult edge case, isn't it? Appiah tackles this by emphasizing conversation and negotiation rather than imposition. The universal respect for dignity provides a very thin framework. It sets basic boundaries, like perhaps prohibiting extreme cruelty or enslavement. But beyond that minimal threshold, disagreements need to be handled through dialogue, through mutual learning, through trying to understand the other culture's perspective, not just judging it by our own standards.
So the universal part is minimal, just enough to enable the conversation, and the rest is worked out locally and interactively.
That's the essence of it. His book, Cosmopolitanism, Ethics in a World of Strangers, really serves as a blueprint for this. It's about finding ways to engage across difference respectfully, acknowledging shared humanity without demanding uniformity. It makes the universal claim modest, leaving maximum space for cultural particularity.
Okay, that's a framework for how cultures might interact. What about the internal sense of self? The sources also bring up Charles Taylor's work, particularly Sources of the Self. How does that fit in?
Taylor takes a deep historical dive into the Western concept of the self. The idea of the autonomous, inward-looking, rational individual that many in the West take for granted as universal.
And he argues it's not universal.
Not at all. He meticulously traces its origins, showing how this specific way of understanding personhood is the result of a long, complex, and very particular journey through Western history, involving Christianity, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, Romanticism, specific economic changes. It's a cultural construction.
So when someone from that background assumes that everyone, everywhere, either is or should be this kind of atomized, self-reliant individual making purely rational choices,
They're making a huge mistake. Taylor would argue, and the sources echo this, that imposing that specific Western model of the self onto other cultures is a form of intellectual violence.
violence through erasure.
Precisely. Because many cultures understand the self quite differently, maybe as fundamentally relational, deeply embedded in family, community, tradition, or even the natural world. When you insist that the only valid self is the autonomous individual, you're essentially telling people their own lived reality, their own history of self-understanding is illegitimate. You're erasing their way of being in the world.
That really highlights how even our most basic psychological assumptions can be culturally loaded. It's not just about ethics or politics, it's about the very definition of being human.
Absolutely. And this connects directly to another key thinker mentioned, Amartya Sen, and his critique of what he calls solitarist identities.
Solitarist identities. What does he mean by that?
He's talking about the dangerous tendency, especially in politics and conflict, to reduce people to a single overriding identity category. You are only Western or only Muslim or only defined by your nationality or your ethnicity. Everything else about you gets ignored.
Like putting people into rigid, mutually exclusive boxes.
Exactly. Sen argues this is intellectually lazy and politically disastrous. It fuels an us versus them mentality and ignores the complexity of real human lives. His solution, outlined in books like Identity and Violence, is to emphasize our multiple affiliations.
The fact that we're all many things at once.
Right. You might be American and a doctor and a parent and love classical music and volunteer at a local charity and have ancestry from Ireland. Sen insists we recognize and value all these overlapping identities.
And how does that help bridge the universal particular divide?
Because it breaks down those hard, solitarist walls. When you see people not just as monolithic members of another culture, but as individuals with complex identities, you start to see shared interests, shared values, shared experiences across those supposed divides. You might disagree vehemently on politics, but find common ground as parents or professionals or fans of the same football team.
It creates more potential points of connection, revealing shared humanity beneath the surface differences. It's a pragmatic way to find common ground without demanding everyone be the same.
Precisely. It allows for particularity, all those different affiliations, while constantly pointing towards the potential for universal connection through those overlaps.
These ideas, cosmopolitanism, the situated self, multiple identities, they offer powerful theoretical tools. And the sources suggest we can actually see these dynamics playing out vividly in literature, particularly from writers navigating cultural borderlands.
Yes, literature becomes a kind of laboratory for exploring hybridity. Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands La Frontera, the new Mestiza, is cited as a prime example.
She writes about the U.S.-Mexico border not just geographically, but culturally, linguistically.
Exactly. She inhabits that space of friction, the Nepantla, the in-between. And crucially, she doesn't just describe it, she theorizes it. Her concept of the new Mestiza consciousness is itself a philosophical position.
A consciousness that refuses to choose, that embraces the hybridity.
Yes. It rejects the demand for purity, the either of logic of dominant cultures, either fully assimilated American or purely traditional Mexican. The Mestiza consciousness finds strength and insight precisely in the tension, in holding multiple, sometimes conflicting cultural realities simultaneously. It's a way of knowing that arises from the border itself.
So the border isn't just a line on a map. It's a site for creating a new kind of understanding, one that inherently challenges the idea of separate monolithic traditions.
That's the core of it. And Salman Rushdie, in a different way, explores similar territory. His use of magical realism in novels like Midnight's Children isn't just fantasy.
The sources suggest it's a philosophical technique.
In a way, yes. Magical realism allows him to portray worlds where different logics, different realities coexist. You have the ancient, mythical, traditional consciousness of India bumping right up against the bureaucratic, rational, often absurd logic of the post-colonial state.
And his characters are caught in the middle, embodying that clash.
Exactly. They live lives shaped by both ancient prophecies and modern political decrees, by both deep cultural memory and the forces of globalization. Their hybridity, their struggle to make sense of these colliding worlds, mirrors the larger philosophical challenge.
So literature, through writers like Ansel Dua and Rushdie, doesn't just illustrate the problem, it actually performs the synthesis. It shows us characters and consciousnesses that are both particular and, in their complex humanity, universal.
It demonstrates that identity isn't about choosing sides, but about weaving together the different threads of our inheritance and experience. The universal perhaps isn't found by erasing the particular, but by understanding how particulars intersect and overlap in complex hybrid ways.
Okay, so if we accept these insights that knowledge is situated, that identities are complex and hybrid, that universal claims need extreme caution, then the question becomes, how do we actually think about these different cultural realities productively? We need a mental toolkit, right?
We do. Simply saying everything is relative isn't very helpful and can lead to paralysis. We need ways to engage respectfully and critically across these divides.
And this is where the sources introduce that really intriguing, maybe slightly unconventional methodological idea,
Yeah.
the cofactual lens. But before we get to that, we need to firmly grasp the concept it builds on, Donna Haraway's idea of situated knowledges.
Right. Haraway powerfully critiques the traditional scientific ideal of objectivity, what she calls the God trick, of seeing everything from nowhere, the view from above, detached and universal.
She argues that's an illusion.
A dangerous illusion, often used to mask specific perspectives, usually dominant ones, as universal truths. Haraway insists that all knowledge comes from somewhere. It's produced by embodied beings located in specific times, cultures, histories, social positions. Knowledge is always situated.
So acknowledging your position, your limitations, your perspective isn't a weakness. It's actually a requirement for more honest, more accountable knowledge.
Exactly. It's about partial perspective, not totalizing claims. Now take that idea that all knowledge is situated, emerging from a specific context, and let's push it using this cofactual lens concept.
Which, as the sources mention, is borrowed conceptually from science fiction, specifically the show Fringe. That seems like an unusual place to find a cultural theory tool.
It is unusual, but the concept itself is powerful for this debate. In Fringe, a cofactual reality isn't just a hypothetical what if, it's a fully realized parallel universe that branched off from our own timeline at some key historical divergence point. It has its own consistent history, its own laws of physics, sometimes subtly different, its own coherent development.
Okay, so it's not just an alternative possibility, but a concrete existing alternative reality within the story's logic. And the key is that both realities, our universe and the cofactual one, are presented as equally valid, equally real, just different because of that historical split.
Precisely. The mental discipline the concept imposes is accepting the simultaneous existence of two complete, internally consistent yet potentially contradictory realities. Now apply that framework to cultural and philosophical differences.
Ah, I see. So instead of seeing another culture's philosophy as simply wrong or less developed compared to ours, we view it as the logical outcome of a different historical trajectory, a different cofactual branch.
Exactly. It's a powerful reframing tool, and the sources suggest it helps illuminate this universal particular debate in at least four really useful ways.
Okay, let's break those down. What's the first way?
First, it reframes culture itself. We move beyond seeing it as just a collection of static traits or beliefs. They value X, they believe Y. Instead, the cofactual lens encourages us to see a culture's philosophical landscape, its ethics, its epistemology, its metaphysics, as the coherent causal outcome of its own unique history, its own key divergence points from other timelines.
So, for example, we wouldn't just say indigenous cultures often have a holistic worldview. We'd ask, what historical developments, what different relationship with land or community, what divergence points led to this holistic system being the logical, coherent outcome for this timeline?
Precisely. Think about that divergence point mentioned earlier. What if the European Enlightenment hadn't driven such a hard wedge between reason on one side and tradition, emotion, and nature on the other? You can imagine a cofactual West branching off from that point, developing a philosophy that might look much more integrated, more relational, closer perhaps to some non-Western systems.
That makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
It grants other philosophical systems the same kind of internal consistency and historical legitimacy that we automatically assume for our own. They're not just random variations, they're the logical physics of a different branch of reality.
Right. That's the first benefit. The second follows directly. It helps dissolve the unhelpful right versus wrong dynamic when cultures clash.
Let's go back to that Central America example, the global corporation versus the local community.
Under the old model, it's easy to frame it as the universal logic of capitalism versus stubborn or irrational local resistance. The cofactual lens reframes it entirely.
How so?
We see the corporate practices, shareholder primacy, contractual focus, as the logical systemic outcome of its cofactual timeline, maybe branching off with the intense financialization of Western economies. And we see the community's resistance, based on long-term stewardship and communal rights, as the equally logical defense of its coherent cofactual reality, rooted in different historical relationships to land and society.
So neither side is simply wrong. They're operating according to the self-evident laws of their respective branching histories. It forces a kind of systemic empathy.
Exactly. You have to understand why their rules make sense within their system, even if those rules clash fundamentally with yours. You're seeing a collision between two different, internally coherent operating systems.
Okay, that's powerful. What's the third application?
It takes Donna Haraway's situated knowledge concept and makes it incredibly visceral. If we accept this model, even metaphorically, then our own deeply held universal truths, well, they're revealed for what they might be.
The local laws of our particular cofactual branch.
Precisely. The principles that seem self-evident, natural, inescapable to us, they might seem that way simply because they are the consistent outcome of our specific history, our divergence points. It forces a radical kind of humility.
So the intellectual move isn't just acknowledging bias passively, it's actively asking, what specific historical turns, what technological or social divergences led to this particular principle feeling like universal common sense to me in my cultural timeline?
Yes. It becomes a practical tool for intellectual honesty. You have to visualize the branching points, the path dependencies that created your obvious truths. It makes the situatedness unavoidable.
That's a really sharp way to think about bias. Okay, and the fourth benefit. This one addresses the worry about relativism, right? If all these realities are coherent, does anything matter?
Right. If both timelines are valid, how do we avoid just shrugging and saying, anything goes? The cofactual lens, drawing from its narrative origins, suggests a way forward.
How? What happens in the story?
In the story, characters don't just observe the other reality from a distance. They're often forced to interact, to negotiate. They have to learn the rules, the physics, the motivations of the other side. Not to judge it, but to find ways to coexist. Sometimes even to cooperate against shared threats that cross timelines.
So the goal isn't to prove one timeline right and the other wrong or to merge them into one. It's about finding ways to manage the interaction.
Exactly. It maps perfectly onto Appiah's idea of a thin cosmopolitanism. The aim isn't to create one grand unified philosophy for all possible timelines. It's to develop a minimal set of protocols, some basic rules of engagement, maybe call it an inter-universal traffic treaty, that allows these fundamentally different coherent systems to interact without destroying each other.
A treaty based on mutual recognition of systemic integrity, even amidst profound difference.
That's the idea. It shifts the focus from establishing universal content to establishing universal protocols for engagement. It respects the particularity of each cofactual branch while seeking pragmatic ways to navigate the intersections.
So the cofactual lens isn't just a way to understand difference. It's a tool for imagining how to live with profound difference without demanding assimilation or resorting to conflict. It's like putting on special glasses that let you see the deep, logical structure of another worldview, demanding respect even if you don't agree with its premises.
Beautifully put. It encourages us to approach philosophical and cultural disagreements, not as errors to be corrected, but as encounters with coherent alternative realities that require careful navigation and perhaps a willingness to negotiate the terms of interaction.
Wow. Okay, so this deep dive has really taken us on a journey. We started with that fundamental tension, the pull towards universal truths versus the powerful reality of cultural context.
We saw how claims of universality, like Hegel's, historically became tools of exclusion, contrasting sharply with non-Western ideas of philosophy as perhaps an ongoing process, not a final destination.
Then we looked at the concrete impacts Sabe's Orientalism, revealing the construction of the other, and those case studies in bioethics and corporate behavior, showing how abstract global rules can fail disastrously when they ignore local realities, and Spivak's warning about inadvertently silencing the marginalized even when trying to help.
But then we move towards potential solutions, exploring the architects of hybridity, Appiah's cosmopolitanism finding a balance, Taylor showing how the self is situated, Sen arguing against solitarist identities, and writers like Anzaldúa and Rushdie embodying hybrid consciousness.
And finally, we landed on that fascinating methodological tool, the cofactual lens, using it to reframe culture as a causal system, dissolve right-wrong binaries, make situated knowledge visceral, and point towards a path beyond relativism towards negotiated coexistence, that interuniversal traffic treaty.
It brings us back to a place of acknowledging profound difference, but perhaps with more sophisticated tools for understanding and engaging with it respectfully.
So if we take that cofactual idea seriously, even as a thought experiment, if we accept that our own philosophical system, the ethics and reasoning that feel utterly natural and self-evident to us, might just be the logical outcome of our specific historical timeline, our cofactual branch.
Then here's the final provocation for you, the listener, to really wrestle with, inspired by that idea of the interuniversal traffic treaty.
What is the single most fundamental principle or belief within your own worldview, something you hold as almost non-negotiable, that you would have to be willing to suspend, bracket, or at least hold loosely in order to genuinely understand the internal logic of a cofactual reality, another culture's coherent system that fundamentally contradicts it?
Is it the primacy of the individual, the separation of religion and state, the definition of progress, the nature of time? What core assumption would you need to temporarily set aside to truly sign that treaty, to engage authentically across that deep systemic difference? Something to ponder as you navigate the many coexisting realities of our own complex world. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the source material you provided.
Until next time.